Well, welcome everyone. I'd like to thank everybody for coming out tonight to talk about cryptocurrency and crypto wallets. I'm really excited about our guest for tonight, James Loperfido. Did I pronounce that correctly? All right,
You
cool.
you did. It's easy to mispronounce, but thank you, Robert, for having me. Happy to join and chat with you guys.
Awesome. I was practicing your last name all day. But before we get into that, a little bit about the South MIT Enterprise Forum of South Florida. We're a nonprofit volunteer organization between the intersection of technology and business. We create educational forums to educate the public about innovative ideas and emerging technologies and the use case scenarios for businesses and how to adopt them and scale with the technologies. And today is our third part of crypto and blockchain. In previous ones, on our blockchain series, we learned about a lot of business case use cases for public and private blockchain technologies. Today, we'll focus on the end users, like how individual people could interact with these ledgers and use wallets. We have a really exciting guest, James. Um, he's with Tandem, and they're a wallet, a physical wallet. Um, do you want to introduce yourself really quickly?
Yeah, sure. So I think it always helps to have some not only professional but personal background. So I'll try to weave in to why I'm somewhat qualified to talk about this, even though I still wouldn't consider myself an expert. There's a lot of people that are doing groundbreaking work with these frontier technologies who know more than I do, but I'm pretty good at explaining how wallets work since I do that for about 80% of my day job. But I've always been involved in tech startups since I left being a trader on Wall Street in 2012. In between, opened up my own businesses and really caught the decentralization bug in 2014, 2015 after reading a few books, not just about cryptocurrencies themselves, but governance frameworks, not just in the United States, but around the world, and thought decentralization was a good solution to a lot of these problems. And so I jumped headlong into the industry, moved to San Francisco to work with a decentralized startup that was working on a Bluetooth mesh communication network such that you could have a completely decentralized and potentially anonymized internet underpinning personal or peer-to-peer communications that was not only aimed at people using it, but also IoT devices, which will, essentially become a very big use case because it sits very squarely at the intersection of the automation that smart contracts and blockchain payment networks allow for. But as the trilemma, as we know it, is solved, microtransactions should be happening on a regular basis. And because instantaneous settlement would exist in this future, it makes sense that IoT device and transactions associated with them would be automated on a fractional scale. So that was my first kind of foray into the decentralized space. And from there, I moved to a company called Soramitsu, which built a Hyperledger framework, which is a private, well, not necessarily private, it's an open source framework for a DLT or blockchain based framework that you can then use to make a private permission network, for example. Soramitsu is a leading developer in the space, I would say, in that they're one of very few who have completed a complete retail quasi CBDC program for the National Bank of Cambodia. Central banks are also looking into using these frameworks, DLT or blockchain, to create retail payment networks. And Soramitsu, amongst those other contributions, has done other things, including build many wallet and identity applications themselves. So I worked there for a year and really got my my feet wet in the space in a very detailed way when it came to retail payments, central bank digital currency, different blockchain frameworks, and all the things associated with it. And so for the past year, I've been with a company called Tangent, which makes what we call hardware wallets, right? Which essentially function as cold storage. And I'll explain further how they work with respect to other types of wallets. But I think, Robert, you had a few good questions that you wanted to kick the show off with. So happy to start from there and see where the conversation leads us. And everybody, please feel free to write questions and make this as interactive as you'd like. I'm happy to entertain questions along the way.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks, James, for that introduction. And like James was saying, if any of the audience member have questions, this is more going to be a conversational design. So if you do have any questions, please feel free to use either the chat or the question and answer, and just chime in, and we'll work all the questions into the conversation. So this event's specifically about cryptocurrency and using it as an investment or a currency per se. Can you go back to the beginning as to like, what is the main difference between Bitcoin or cryptocurrency and a traditional fiat currency?
Sure. You'll probably hear people repeat this idea whenever you start talking about cryptocurrencies being digital currencies, saying that 95% of all currencies in the world are already digital, right? Meaning that financial transactions across the world already take place on a ledger, right? That ledger happens to be centralized to some degree and controlled by counterparties like banks, you know, so whether central banks, commercial banks, or essentially custodian solutions or payment solutions like PayPal or Venmo or what have you. So the idea that it's just new digital money, right, is only a very small part of the puzzle there, right? As we know, like I just said, digital money exists ubiquitously as it is. In Sweden, for example, they hardly ever use cash, even for retail transactions. And there's good reasons and trade-offs with that and all else. But cryptocurrencies use, generally speaking, asymmetric cryptography to create peer-to-peer public permissionless networks by which anybody can transfer value to anybody else in the world without the need for an intermediary, right? So I don't necessarily need a bank anymore to process a transaction, charge me a fee, and send money. And currently, as it stands, blockchain public networks do charge fees as well. But because of the advent of asymmetric cryptography and its use in payments, and the ability to scale those networks with respect to throughput, security, and decentralization, transaction fees are likely going to go closer to zero, right? Because of this technology. And so that's generally what I would say differs between, existing forms of digital money and cryptocurrencies. And of course, as we know, there's all different kinds, and we can go further into detail about, what exactly those are and what they represent and what's possible with them.
Yeah. So the main thing around it is about control and centralized versus decentralized, and also ownership and control over your assets. Can you touch a little bit about bearer assets and digital bearer assets and how that differs?
Sure. So I can quickly summarize kind of, the history of money, and anybody that's generally interested in this stuff should start there, right? When in the feudal ages, or whenever we decided to start using a physical element, right, instead of just bartering from one good to the other, right, we created a mechanism that's a store of value, medium of exchange, and unit of account, right? The king may have paid you in gold for services that you provided in his fiefdom, and then you had this physical thing by which everybody agrees to the value of with respect to the goods and services that you purchase with it, right? And so what that medium is doesn't necessarily matter, right? As long as you and I believe in its store of value, medium of exchange and unit of account that we can all rely on and is stable enough to measure the goods and services that we need to transact with, because it makes all of those things more efficient, right? So cryptocurrencies, you can think of just another step of efficiency in that process, right? It's that medium of account or medium of exchange, store of value, and unit of account, depending on the structure of that currency, right? That's all a currency is. And so when stocks were first invented, when there were joint stock companies where you needed to prove ownership of your rights, right? To have a claim on an asset, right? There was physical pieces of paper that entitled you to those claims. That was what the original bearer asset outside of money itself, right? And so a digital bearer asset is a claim that you have against the issuer of a token, right? So Ripple Labs issued XRP token. I, with the private keys generated using elliptic curve cryptography, have a claim of ownership to that token, whether it exists in this wallet or wherever, whichever wallet. It is generally recorded on a ledger that is shared, distributed, transparent, and immutable, right? And because of that, there's a public degree of transparency that's available, right? But also the idea of privacy and self-sovereignty and your ability to establish your own identity and take claim of assets without any other counterparty needing to provide you permission to do so.
Yeah, so it kind of reminds me of like when you used to have those stock certificates, you either save them in a vault, like in your office,
Yeah.
or in the safety deposit box at the bank, or like whoever owns or physically holds that is the actual owner of it.
Exactly.
About storage, like how has storage kind of transformed into what it is today with digital wallets, and how does that
Right. So for the most part, historically and concurrently, we've trusted a central institution to custody our assets in many ways, right? The DTCC is the maintainer of the ledger for most of the financial transactions, at least in the United States and parts of the world, in Europe, such that we know that this ledger gets reconciled every day, and we're literally just changing decimals and numbers on this ledger to exchange ownership and keep track of ownership at any given point in time. Distributed ledger technology, as you might imagine, instead of having one central institution govern that, you can have nodes or witnesses or people that can observe that ledger with multiple copies in a way that we know that it's not being tampered with, right? And so how you custody or keep access to your ability to write to that ledger is what we would call public key infrastructure or private key management, right? What is the instrument by which I can stake my claim to the asset of that issuer on that network, and how do I transact and prove that I am who I say I am and I deserve to transact and write to that ledger under that account, right? And it may not be an account in the traditional sense, but it's the ability to alter the ledger so that your public wallet address, which is your record of ownership, right? How do I affect the balance in there? And the way that we do it is with asymmetric cryptography and the keys that are associated with a digital wallet.
Okay. So with the concept out on the board, can we start going into the trade-offs between different wallets and what people are actually using today?
Yeah, so one of the most important ideas is the idea of a custodial or versus a non-custodial wallet, right? The custodial wallet means that you're trusting someone else, right? Let's use Coinbase for an example, to maintain an account for you, hold on to your keys, and manage that account, right? And it requires you to identify yourself and do what we now know as know your customer and anti-money laundering compliance identification processes. And because of that, you're trusting Coinbase when you don't necessarily have to. And the idea of decentralization is that you should maintain ownership of your keys so that no one can ever take them away from you or tamper with it or lose them, right? Because once you lose it, you lose the right to claim the asset that you have a claim on with that issuer, that token, right? So the these exchanges, right, that or DeFi platforms, right, that manage your keys for you, typically they invest in expensive, strong, powerful key management infrastructure so that they can't be tampered with. And it's very easy to trust them most of the time because they're very legitimate companies. They can insure some of the assets or all of the assets, right? And so there isn't much to risk there, right? Depending on your use case. But your use case might dictate what type of wallet you want, right? And so there's custodial, non-custodial, right? And hot, cold, and somewhere in between. A hot wallet is something that is constantly attached to the internet, right? That meaning always you always have the ability to write a transaction to a blockchain, right? Which opens it up to what we would call an attack vector or attack surface. A cold wallet actually physically maintains a key, right? Which is literally a long string of alphanumeric characters that are randomly generated through elliptic curve cryptography. And because it's so random and so long, it's impossible for us to remember, right? For the most part, not many people can remember that many random letters and numbers strung together, right? And because of that, other user experiences needed to be designed if you wanted to maintain self-custody of your keys. Those are hardware wallets like Trezor or Ledger, right? And there's different forms of them. And then there's what we would call a paper wallet, which is where when instead of having that long random hash of numbers and letters, you might have a 12-word seed phrase that you're supposed to keep, right? And that actually becomes almost like a bearer title instrument, right? Because whoever has that can now access your wallet. So in many ways, a paper wallet is much like the stock certificates of old days, right? It's a physical bearer title instrument. Why I joined Tangem, one of the reasons is that they figured out how to do elliptic key cryptography within a small chip that fits in a card, right? And uses only the power of an NFC contact point, not even requiring access to the internet. So they were able to create a sufficient degree of entropy within the mathematics involved in elliptic key cryptography to generate keys inside a card. So this also is like a paper wallet or a bearer title instrument, except that there's an actual set of keys generated in here.
So custodial is more like the old school type of bank. Like it's already pretty much centralized. Yeah. It's a company that's kind of handling it. You trust them to kind of hold the accounts and everything be secure. And then the non-custodial is basically the cold wallets that you kind of hold it on your own and you kind of had to secure it on your own. And just like if you lose the key code or if you lose the card, like what happens? Because on the custodial, you have the banks looking over or the companies looking after it. But when you're on your own and you lose it or it's stolen, like what happens to that with the private keys?
Yeah, because it is a bearer title instrument, if you don't have a copy of it, you lose it, right? It's like losing cash, right? It's what we call store value. And so if you lose it, you lose it, right? So one of the potential solutions to that is what we would call a recovery mechanism or a backup key or redundant keys. It's often referred to as multi-sig depending on the blockchain or the DLT framework. So Tangem had a proof of concept of what we call our twin cards, where you have two cards and either of them can sign for the same wallet address. So that if you lost one, You could always switch it to another wallet address and have another set of redundant keys if you needed to, just to have that backup security, right? So I could keep one of these under my pillow and one of them in a bank vault if I decided to trust a bank, right? But again, at the end of the day, if the saying goes, not your keys, not your crypto, right? So much like gold is actually, it could be confiscated from you should someone find the need to, right? And that would probably be a government if it ever came to that. And it's unlikely now given how legislation and regulation has come about, but that was generally the idea initially.
And then just to backtrack a little bit on the actual wallets and how they're actually
Yeah.
made. There's a lot of different ways to actually implement them. Some of them are open source, some of them are closed source. How do you differentiate what's the best wallet for your case?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and you ended the question with the right words. Like, what is the use case? What do you actually need to do, right? If you're a day trader, right, and you don't care about custody that much because you trust this exchange platform, for example, Robinhood, right? On Robinhood, they're a custodian exchange, right? You're trusting them to manage your access to right to a blockchain, or they even hold assets and just trade them internally amongst themselves, right? And thus, you don't really care because you don't necessarily need to physically have or transport that, or you may only just be interested in speculating, right? So if your only use case is speculation and you have no interest in holding something in the long run, you probably want to find an exchange that doesn't have fees, but you might have to trust them to manage the crypto for you, right? So that's one example. Another example is, say I have a significant amount of Bitcoin and I don't want to trust anybody else with it. Maybe I do want to keep it in cold storage and lock it in a vault, right? Another use case is maybe I have, maybe I make frequent transactions with Bitcoin and I want to be able to pay peer to peer, give someone else Bitcoin, right? Then I might want to self custody a small amount in a card like this, or just be responsible about maintaining my paper wallet that allows me access to transact, right? Using another non-custodial digital wallet. But to answer your question, the use case should dictate your needs, right? And there's all different user experiences. Like you said, some wallets are open source, meaning that anybody can inspect the code and know that there's no back doors or anything suspicious going on. Most cold wallets will, or hardware wallets, I should say, will not open up their firmware, but they might open up some of the software for an application that you may need to interact with the physical chip. And Tangem does this, for example, right? So even though the firmware is closed, right, it's been audited by a third party, in this case, Kudelski, right, which is a trusted auditor, we all hope, right? So if Tangem ever went out of business, for instance, there's an open source SDK by which you can take all the functionality that the Tangem wallet reference app has and build your own wallet if you had to, so that this key would never lose its integrity. You could always access it and request transactions from it.
That's pretty cool. So, so it seems like just kind of like today, most of the majority of people just keeps their cash in the banks, and that's
Yeah.
usually going to be the best case scenario for most people. And
Yeah.
if you have a large sum of money, or a large sum of Bitcoins or cryptocurrency, at that point, that's when you start wanting to look at different options as to where to store it. Is there any disadvantages of holding a large amount in an exchange? Or can you, just like today, trust it?
Yeah, I mean, look, as the reality is that if it's connected to the internet or one other person can access this infrastructure, there's a security threat for sure. There are evolutions in key infrastructure like multi-party compute, where there might be 3 generally trusted entities, but not necessarily needing of trust, who only have pieces of a puzzle, right, that allow you to interact and can maintain your identity, so that no one person or central point of failure exists in terms of the creation and maintenance of those keys. So there's different institutional grade platforms like that being developed and used on behalf of digital asset custodians now. And multi-party compute is one of these newer ideas that provides a good degree of protection. But the reality of cybersecurity is that it has to generally continue to evolve because technology evolves, and with it, also new abilities to create attack vectors and surfaces and generally hack things.
Awesome. We actually have a question from the audience, Carlos. I'm going to allow him to chime in. So Carlos, you could go ahead and speak.
He's still muted. Can you hear us, Carlos? Can you unmute yourself?
Yes. You hear me?
There you go.
Yeah.
You know, like companies like Tesla that have purchased like dollars of Bitcoins, are they going, where do they get the Bitcoins? They get it from like companies like Coinbase, or they have their own setup of miners that they use for buying such a large amount of Bitcoins?
They're most likely going to use an institutional grade prime broker and custodian to buy it on their behalf. Typically, companies like digital currency groups, Genesis Trading. I'm sure that there's other banks. I think Galaxy Digital and a few others do that on behalf of institutional clients, where they will manage your keys in a secure way, right? And there's many different ways to do it. I think Paxos does cold storage in vaults inside of a mountain somewhere. Like, there's all different ways to custody it, and institutional grade solutions obviously exist, but you could mine it, right? Elon Musk could say, I'm going to create exposure by setting up a $10 million mining rig and have a predictable amount of Bitcoin mined over the next 10 years. But that's not what, I don't think that's what they did. I think that they probably just created an account with an institutional prime broker and custodian, and that fiduciary responsible party acted on their behalf.
And I have a, you know, when you go to a place like Coinbase, or you go the Tesla way, you go to institutional, you know, companies like that, what would be a large amount that you consider, okay, Coinbase will be up to like $1 million or $500,000, and then I go institutional. What would be the amount like most people buy?
What's the threshold?
Yeah.
It varies tremendously. There's a bunch of different prime brokerages and exchanges now that all have different minimums and, you know, pricing plans and fees and custodian fees. So it all depends, but yeah, typically in the millions.
Oh, okay. All righty. Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you, Carlos.
Yeah, no problem.
Appreciate the question. Yeah, so he brings up a good point about institutions now adopting Bitcoin and jumping into the game and kind of just, how do I say, creating more of a trusted. They're trusting the
feeling.
system.
Yeah, for sure.
People are open to it now. Do you think with adoption and institutions jumping in, more and more people are just going to adopt it because they see larger institutions jumping in, or it was just an inevitable path that it was always going to be adopted at one point or another?
When it comes to this, right? Remember I said earlier that if two people mutually agree that something is a store of value, unit of count, medium of exchange, right? That's all that is really required for them to be able to exchange value with it, right? And so the paradox of a currency, especially one like Bitcoin, is that the more people believe in it, the more value it has, especially if it has a fixed supply, right? Because if there's a fixed supply and growing belief enhances growing demand, price can only go one direction, right? And over time, the idea, right, is that the price could stabilize and become a payment mechanism, but you could also have a derivative value, right, or a derivative token or something else, or a stable coin, right, that serves as that stable medium of exchange. Whereas a scarce asset like Bitcoin, right, has a fixed supply and becomes a greater and greater store of value, or hedge against what a lot of people are buying it for in the institutional sense, which is a hedge against inflation, right, or debasement of a nation state currency like the dollar. So that would be the impetus, right? But the irony is that the more people believe in it, the more valuable it could become, right? And when institutions give their stamp of approval, that's a signal to the market that, okay, this group of smart people is taking this very seriously, and they're probably in it for the long haul, right? So it creates, without a doubt, a totally different world for Bitcoin and assets like it.
So that brings up an interesting point about the get rich quick schemes, and people trading cryptocurrency just to play the spreads, and then other ones that believe in the long term of it and just want to buy it and hold it because they see the perceived value in the future. What is your thoughts around that?
Many. The first of which is that economic growth doesn't come from wild speculation without the technology that it's invested in having some productive effect, right? If the output is not greater than the input, then there's no increase in productivity, wealth, quality of life, all of the things that we value as progress, right? And so it's very easy to get ahead of your skis when you're investing in something that has potentially justifiable value in the future, but you cannot yet measure, right? A lot of these second layer protocols and tokens that are coming out, as you know, we saw with 2000 in the internet bubble pink sheets, 2018 with the ICO craze and bubble burst, right? We're seeing a lot of, again, with other new segments of cryptocurrencies in the form of DeFi platforms, second layer protocols, NFTs, NFT networks. So it's very easy to speculate, right? And it's easy for many people to speculate and spread that risk across, right? Like it's very easy for 1 million people to risk $1, but it's very hard for one person to risk $1 million, right? So the potential to crowdfund and draw capital for large scale projects with infrastructure that require a lot of development and time, right, are possible, right? And many of them won't make it, right? Just because it's hard, right? Or you'll have 7 different competitors from around the world building the exact same platform, not knowing how far ahead the other one is, right? And 5 of them are likely to fail, and one might buy the second other best, right? And so there's a natural tendency, because of the idea of decentralization itself, for the market to be fragmented. And when there is that fragmentation in the market, right, where there might be a Korean startup building the exact same solution as one in Finland, you don't know which is going to be valuable. You don't even know if their token exists yet, right? So a lot of this is herd mentality and seeing, oh, everybody, this is a popular token. I've heard about it. let me go invest in it, right? And people won't do their own homework, right? And they won't know what justifies the value of the token. And there's other things involved and themes around that, right? Like there's this kind of populism or populist movement with respect to the GameStop phenomenon, for example, where people knew that they could potentially short squeeze a very large hedge fund, right? Which a lot of people claim have better access to more valuable deals than the public does, right? And then you have accredited institutional investor laws where a retail trader doesn't legally have the ability to buy something that an institutional entity might, right? So people are kind of waking up to the idea that there may be imbalances in the way that investments can be ascertained. So there's a lot of different dynamics and themes around that, but I can only begin to answer that question. It's a very long-ended and long-winded question to answer.
Yeah, sometimes it feels like it's still similar to the Wild West. You don't know which coin is actually going to make it, the companies behind it, the people behind it, the motivations and intentions behind their starting it, if it's just money driven or they're actually trying to create technology that's going to be useful in the world.
Exactly. Yeah. Look, it's a very interesting idea because of the incentives that underlie the governance models that these tokens represent, right? Bitcoin is a very simple model, and that's why so many people appreciate it, is because it's in simplicity. There's elegance, right? There's a fixed supply. As long as we know that it's decentralized beyond 50%, 51%, right? It's very difficult to be hacked. It's proven the test of time. We don't know who invented it, right? And that person or people may be very wealthy, or that those tokens could just be burned in a wallet. We don't know, right? But the idea is that it's generally decentralized. No one single institution can govern it, right? And so therefore it's representative of many voices and not one. The supply is fixed, so therefore it cannot be manipulated very easily, if at all. And it's censorship resistant. But the incentives that underlie it are very important, right? And some of the argument around Bitcoin from the negative side is that it's like a Ponzi scheme. The people who get in first are rewarded the most, right? And it's true, but it also incentivizes adoption of something that's very difficult to break, right? So there's these incentive mechanisms that are just considerations with Bitcoin, but are programmable through any digital currency and token, are what make it very interesting, right? Because you can incentivize people to save. You can incentivize people to buy certain things. You can incentivize people to behave certain ways. And that's where the underlying economics get very interesting in terms of what's possible with the token and its governance framework and tokenomics.
Yeah, Bitcoin is now over $1 trillion market cap. And so the adoption is widespread. But then at the same time, there's still a lot more adoption to be had. We had another question. All right, it is recorded. So with Bitcoin, lost my train of thought for a second.
That's all right. I can keep talking if you'd like. So, beyond Bitcoin as an example, right? You could make the argument that, Bitcoin was created in essence to prevent a central bank from debasing a currency, right? That was the original claim of Satoshi Nakamoto, which was essentially in a satirical way embedded into the Genesis block of Bitcoin code, right? I'll let you guys do that Google search and see it yourself if you haven't learned about it yet, but you should always start by reading the white paper. And it begs the question, if there were a world reserve currency that wasn't the US dollar, what could it be? And if it wasn't a nation state currency, what would it be, right? A decentralized currency that aligned interests of all governments and central banks and people. Is that possible, right? And what mechanisms would you have to create for it to be viable? And so that's kind of the philosophical question, right? What is the most valuable structure with respect to governance and incentives to create economic value, rapid allocation of resources to productive economic uses, and how do you frame that, and how do you distribute it, right? There's obviously tons of social and economic and political considerations, right, embedded in that. But that's kind of also the interesting thing about decentralization, right?
So with that said, and with the volatile price and the price of Bitcoin constantly going up, will it ever be stable that you could actually use it as a currency to buy anything at the retail store, for instance?
Yeah, I think there's a few ways of looking at that, right? Say Bitcoin serves now, as it does, as a reserve asset to other digital assets, right? Whereas if there's a token sale, most of the time, or many of the times, this new token might require you to purchase it with Bitcoin or Ethereum. So in essence, they become reserve assets to a degree. And Bitcoin is especially so because of its supply model or monetary policy. But for instance, if enough people adopted Bitcoin, right, theoretically, and I'm not the owner of this theory, right? I want to say the idea is that if enough people purchased Bitcoin over time, the price would generally stabilize, right? And because it's infinitely divisible essentially into Satoshis, right? 1/100 millionth of a Bitcoin, that it would be like pennies or $1 or whatever, right? And it doesn't necessarily matter what my hand, that it has a specific value that everybody else agrees to, right? And right now, most of the world, or a lot of the world, is used to denominating things, right? So maintaining that psychological ability to understand that a hamburger is worth $5 and not 50 is an important function, right, of a currency. Maybe a currency doesn't always need to serve the function of a payment mechanism. Maybe it's just a store of value, right? And that's why stable coins and something like Bitcoin could coexist the same way that physical gold and fiat exist, right? So there's all sorts of parallels there, but generally speaking, right now, Bitcoin would not be a good payment mechanism because it's so volatile, right? And you could rapidly now exchange it into something that is more stable, so it becomes much more of it has more utility that way. But it remains to be seen whether or not it will stabilize, or there will be better tokens that come along, or central banks will simply just issue stable coins that have all of the good features that cryptocurrencies might have that we need or care about, with some blend of central management and privacy and decentralization. What the future holds is uncertain. My guess is as good as yours, but for me, what I would say is interesting about decentralization is that it is borderless and doesn't necessarily need to rely on governments or nation states as issuers. And so if you had a currency that wasn't manipulable and did not have biases supported by warfare, for instance, you might have a better allocation of resources globally such that they're allocated where they're needed most to enhance productivity that benefits the greatest number of people, for instance.
So Bitcoin at the moment, it seems like it's not the best idea to use it to pay for things, but to receive payment for things, that might be a better to receive.
If you anticipate it growing in value, right, and you don't think that that cash will increase in value at the same rate, which is unlikely, then yeah, I might want to be paid and hold most of what I call M1 or cash in Bitcoin instead. And people are investigating that right now, institutions themselves.
And then for the audience members, if they would want to get into Bitcoin and buy something, I would assume the best suggestion now is just to do an exchange wallet.
That would be my first suggestion because it's the simplest, right? It's just like making a Gmail account, right? You are trusting them with your keys, but there's a good degree of security around that, right? Coinbase hasn't lost anybody's money, right? And the reason is because they have good security. But again, you have to invest, right, with your own wit and not rely on things that you aren't certain are true. So obviously it comes with its risks. A lot of people would view these as risk assets that are so far off what finance calls the capital asset pricing model that you can't even assign a risk premium to it with respect to an interest rate or rate of return because it's so far off the charts, right? It's beyond even venture investing because the odds of one token becoming valuable are so small. But I could be proven wrong there as well.
And then with the different exchanges or the different wallets, like you start buying through Coinbase or any other like smaller exchange that you could buy a little bit at a time. At what point do you start considering, should I keep all of this in this wallet or start exchanging it to different wallets? And then just kind of like now, people have multiple banks and multiple bank accounts and start spreading the money around. Like at what point do you start thinking about that and start doing those type of things?
Yeah, I think it all depends on your personal risk appetite, right? For instance, now there are DeFi platforms and applications like Celsius, for instance, which will custody your assets on your behalf, but pay you an interest rate for holding it there and the ability to use that as collateral to provide loans, right? So that's the idea of decentralized finance, right? Is that I no longer need a bank to process a loan that I issue to another person, right? And you could do it in aggregate at scale and size with enough security and collateral such that systemic risk may be taken out of the equation if it's done properly, right? And there's a lot of games being played with yield farming and people getting ahead of themselves in terms of, what type of reserves and collateral are required for such loans. But the idea generally is that you don't need a bank to clip an interest rate or, basis points on a loan or even necessarily underwrite it, given that this technology exists where everybody can freely transfer money to one another.
Cool. I'd like to remind the audience, if you do have any questions, please share it in the question and answer portion or in the chat, and we'll go ahead and have the guests answer those. So we have two questions. Before we get into security, just touch on real quick on the tulip speculation in Holland. They feel like Bitcoin price is very volatile. It only goes up because people want it to. History is full of examples where people get burned. The tulip speculation in Holland. What makes Bitcoin
Yeah.
unstable versus relatively fixed currency like the US?
Well, what makes it unstable is that there's a fixed supply, right? And its use case right now isn't anything beyond a store of value, right? Or a hedge against inflationary monetary policy. So that's generally what differentiates it, right? And maintaining stability of a currency that belies an entire economy and using the velocity of money or increased supply or lower interest rates to ensure that the economy functions smoothly is not an easy thing to manage, right? But with respect to comparing it to the tulip, say, or even gold, for instance, it comes down to utility, right? The interesting features of Bitcoin are that, again, it's fixed supply, censorship resistant, and I don't need an intermediary to process the exchange of value from me to anybody else on the planet, right? And that's valuable. And with the potential or idea of adding a second layer that speeds up that process and or reduces the fees, makes it essentially a frictionless transaction of value across the world over the internet with nobody else involved, right? I would say that's a little bit more valuable than a tulip.
Awesome.
See where I'm coming from there?
Yeah, definitely. So let's go back on the topic of wallets and how to keep them secure. We had a question about hardware wallets. Can you talk about a good way to back up seed words for hardware wallets? Mine came with a paper sheet to write them down, but that seems risky. Do you recommend adding
Yeah.
additional words as a passphrase?
Well, the idea is that you aren't creating those words, right? Those words are just a replacement for the long hash of numbers and letters that you couldn't otherwise remember, right? So they give you a little bit simpler words that maybe you could remember, but are very difficult to. And the point of them being difficult is that they make you write it down on a piece of paper so that it becomes that bearer title. The only other alternative is to have something like a physical wallet, like a Tangent card or a Trezor or a Ledger, or a custodial solution. Those are generally your options. And so, there are secure enclaves or secure cloud storage systems that you would trust, again, a central party, whether it was Microsoft or Amazon or Google or Apple, right? Apple has secure iCloud storage, right? And even when you create a BRD wallet, which is a very popular one of the options is that you could store your seed phrase in the iCloud vault, right? And trust that Apple has your best interests and privacy in mind. And generally, they're pretty good about that. But at the end of the day, again, that's a slight security risk, but I would say a tolerable one.
So really,
and your phone can also hold your keys, right? That's another. There are secure enclaves in your phone that you can trust to hold your keys as well.
The whole topic of trust is like one of the biggest things that comes up with cryptocurrency and Bitcoin. Being able to trust who do you trust to hold the assets for you and whatnot. I think trust is a huge component of it right now. And I guess it is building a trust within a trustless system in a way.
Exactly. Yeah. The idea of decentralization is that you don't need to trust an intermediary, right? You just need to trust the code, right? That code lives in a distributed way, right? Anybody can view it. It's open source. Anybody can access it. You cannot alter it. And the it's assumed that the nodes and validators of the network provide adequate security, right, without the risk of, you know, a 51% attack or similar. And you know, the consensus mechanism and the governance framework and the tokenomics are all a part of trusting that system to do the right thing, right? But the beauty of it is that it's readily available for anybody to see, right? You can audit the Bitcoin code yourself. There are block explorers where you could see that this block was, you know, hashed and sealed with these transactions, with these public addresses, and this is what the ledger looks like at this moment in time. And that's where the trustlessness is, right? But the idea generally is to minimize the need for trust, right? You don't need to rely on an intermediary party, but now you have the option not to. Before something like Bitcoin, you didn't have that option, and that's why it's interesting.
So we have half an hour left for the event. So wanted to open it up for any of the audience members if you have any question and answer period. If you do want to chime in and be a part of the conversation, please raise your hand and we'll add you so you can speak and ask your questions as well. One thing that comes to mind is we have the wallets, we create the wallets, we store the value within the wallets, and it's kind of creating an ownership of our own assets. And the original idea behind Bitcoin was this whole idea of self-sovereignty identity. So can you talk a little bit about that and how a digital asset correlates to self-sovereignty? And what's a correlation?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So self-sovereign identity, it's not a new idea, right? But the advent of crypto networks and digital assets as they exist kind of prompted them to resurface a little bit. And as of late, there's been a great effort on behalf of many organizations to come up with mutually acceptable and beneficial standards around the creation of a self-sovereign identity, right? And the idea is that I can establish the rights to my own identity, right, in a permanent, immutable way, such that I don't necessarily need another issuer to attest to the fact that I exist, right? I can claim my identity in a digital way, and I can stake my claim against digital assets using that digital identity, and also take ownership of any of the credentials that are associated with my identity. If not just are the idea of credentials in a digital format that are either attested to by a third party, verified by a third party, and owned by the user, the holder, the individual, right? And because of that, I can select which things about myself, my identity, my credentials that I want to disclose to any counterparty in any use case. For example, if I had an SSI, I might have a third-party attestation by the state of Florida that says I am 21 years of age, and I could present that value and have it verified by a third party, like a bouncer at a bar that knows that I'm 21, and I provided him that credential, and it's trusted because it's attested by a third party that he has to trust, right? But he doesn't need to know my address or my actual birth date or the color of my eyes, right? All he needs to know is that I'm of legal drinking age. And so the interesting part about self-sovereign identity is the ability to claim your own identity and any of the digital assets, whether it be money, identity credentials, data that are associated with your likeness, right? And then the potential exists for you to monetize it. And GDPR in Europe and legislation that I actually happen to testify for in the state of New York around privacy will likely lend itself to us being able to establish self-sovereign identity regardless of what third-party attestations are required to do it, right? So I may not necessarily even have to rely on the US government for me to establish my own self-sovereign global identity, right? And because of that, it's, you know, say people were identified in a way that maximized the ability to transact in a safe and wholesome way, but also provided the degree of privacy that makes most people comfortable. You have a pretty good solution to kind of the prerequisite for the ubiquitous use of digital assets in any landscape, physical or digital. And that's why identity and payments are very interesting, right? Because with the advent of something like privacy coins, right, where I could have a completely anonymous transaction on an anonymized network with nobody having to know who I am, that kind of sets the paradigm for the potential for complete privacy, which is probably not used for good reasons, right? It's probably used for nefarious reasons, right? And complete transparency is just too much for most people, right? Like, you don't need to know how much money I have or you know, where I live, right? But you might need to know certain things about me to trust a transaction, right? And all of those things are possible and programmable with the right combination of identity standards and digital asset standards and currency standards. And the more interoperable they are and the more universal they are, the easier it is for me to operate the same way that I do in the United States as I would in China, for instance, right? And so there's a natural tendency, hopefully, for standards across countries, across you know, companies, businesses, whatever parties exist, right? For there to be interoperability standards with respect to both identity and digital assets of all kinds, right? Because that enables frictionless exchange. And if done well, can eliminate bad actors. And you could automatically collect taxes and ensure that authority transparency that everybody can attest to. So those are the kind of potential outcomes of the right combinations of identity and digital asset standards.
That still seems like a very far along way from today.
We're getting there.
Yeah.
There's been really big strides. Sovereign Foundation, Evernym, Trust over IP, the World Economic Forum. There's a lot of value in having identity credentials and self-sovereign identity that nobody can take away from you, right? A lot of good use cases can come of that. For example, distribution of aid to refugees who physically don't even have paper documentation to stake claim of ownership in anything, right? But with a $2 card and chip or $3 card and chip, however much this thing costs, I can have physical ownership representing my digital identity and any of the digital assets that I should have a claim to. So that's where it gets really interesting, is how do these affect real world commerce? And there are many use cases and things happening as we speak that are actually pushing this technology forward. And it's probably going to happen faster than you'd imagine.
So back to the topic of wallets. If wallets are used to store the digital assets, in this term, in first case is cryptocurrency, and then other digital assets. I'm thinking like the majority of money that transfers between companies are for advertisements. and just data that we share throughout the internet? Is it going to get to a point that I'm going to be able to use my wallet or Tandem card and just track all of the data that I transferred to, and then that data becomes valuable and I'm able to exchange it with other companies that want to advertise toward me? And just owning that data would just make it more valuable, just like owning Bitcoin would make it more valuable at the same time?
Absolutely. For sure. Yeah, there's a lot of people that are projecting that to be true. There's some really interesting companies and concepts around that. A friend of mine, his name is Dele Atanda, created a set of protocols around that very idea, and he's not the only one. His company happens to be called MetaMe, and he came up with a really cool framework for what happens when you own your own data and how you monetize it and exchange it with companies that you might have an interest in supporting or being receiving advertisements from. So there's all sorts of ways that your personal data is valuable. And right now, with social media platforms, you are the product, right? Your data is being sold to advertisers, right? And so there's, again, growing populist sentiment around the idea that you should be the custodians of your own data and digital assets. Why shouldn't you be, right? If they're of your likeness, right? You might have signed them over to somebody else out of convenience, right? Or negligence. But now, because of these developing technologies, you have the ability to stake those claims of digital asset ownership in a way that those assets are transferable. Everybody knows if you own them, if you need to prove that, and it allows for a more seamless allocation of resources and exchange of value.
Nice, that's super interesting. All right, just want to remind the audience, if you do have any questions, you could use the question and answer, or just raise your hand if you just want to speak your question. Those are all the questions that I had. Trying to think off the top of my head.
I tend to, the reason why I got interested in this space in the first place was because I saw the potential for there to be currencies that solve problems that are supranational, right? Like climate change, for instance. If you agreed with, the consensus, pun intended, around climate change, or the fact that we can, not even necessarily climate change, let's just say pollution, for example, in many of its forms, plastic waste. If you had programmable money that incentivized people to reduce their spending on specific items that were packaged in plastic, you could provide an avenue for them to have an effect on things that was a net positive for everybody, right? So if you're looking at it again, right, the things that make us happier, right, the things that give us more time, more leisure time, increased productivity, increased quality of life, all of those things are much more easily attainable if biases are removed and incentives are built in to the system, right? And I'm not saying that's an easy thing to do, and it's very hard to tie it to the real world, but the right incentives will usually produce the best outcomes, right? So the fact that you can program money with a governance model and with different tokenomics and different ideas is what makes digital currency in the form that it exists now very interesting. So I'm hoping to see more understanding, and I think a lot of it begins like right here, where people are learning about what the potential really is, right? The potential isn't just speculating and getting rich. That's not really what it's supposed to be about. The potential is about growth that can enable frictionless exchange of value and resource allocation to where it's needed most, so that the whole pie gets bigger, right? It's not about taking a piece of the pie, it's about baking a bigger one. So I think that's generally why this stuff interests a lot of us. And it's hard to even verbalize that, right? There's so many concepts and inputs and ideas and topics to consider in the creation of a currency, right? And economics generally, that it's very difficult to put all of these things together and synthesize them into a coherent idea or hypothesis. Not to mention, take that hypothesis and then build a digital economic infrastructure around it, right? But that's what people are trying to do, and it's certainly a valuable and I think attainable goal.
Yeah, so like that makes me think about like the top-down approach, that basically the reason why this is so powerful is because of the collective movement. The more people that come behind it, the more real it becomes, the more projects that are being worked on in order to make it into reality in the digital world. But then if you go all the way down to the individual people, which is the people are coming together, is what makes it powerful. And
absolutely, yeah.
Now, other than just opening up a wallet, creating a wallet on their own, putting a few $100s in, just to be part of the system and kind of grow with it, what can the individual person do in order to get behind the projects that they actually believe in?
Yeah, well, the most important thing is to do your own research. Because everybody has their own propaganda and the bias it arises from, and there is the potential to get very wealthy from investing in something early that has value later. There is always a selfish tendency, right? Even with Bitcoin, right? The creator of Bitcoin owns a lot of Bitcoin, right? He didn't, the potential for that person to become extremely wealthy, right? He knew, or she knew, or they knew when they invented it, right? What's really interesting is the idea of a currency that is distributed in a way that maximizes economic potential for the whole world, right? And it's very hard to figure out because the world's a big place, and our current financial system functions pretty well in many places. And then there's other countries where these tools are very valuable. And I see a question about small payments and fiat and M-Pesa and that kind of thing, and mobile first money solutions, right? And so again, we know that money is just a representation of ownership of something on a digital ledger for the most part, right? Yes, cash is still used in many places, and for many reasons, but the idea is that mobile money made financial access for people that didn't have physical access to an actual bank. There's rural places in the world where internet doesn't exist, right? Where broadband doesn't exist. People have to rely on their mobile carriers for communication, right? And so you can simplify the exchange of money to a text message, right? As long as the backend infrastructure is there to support it. And that's kind of what mobile money platforms in Africa, for example, do. And you don't even need a smartphone to do that. But as consensus mechanisms improve, as the trilemma generally is solved with additional or evolved technology, small payments that are cheap and frictionless and borderless are a very likely outcome. And some layer 1 and layer 2 protocols are further ahead than others in this regard. Stellar is known for being a platform that's good for smaller transactions with smaller fees. But there's many others that are coming about now, and second layer protocols or networks of networks like Polkadot, and second layer protocols like Lightning for Bitcoin, or many of the others proposed for Ethereum. So generally speaking, you needed to rely on someone like Western Union if you only had paper cash, because your own country's currency wasn't a stable enough store of value that it could be used as money, right? So you had to use paper US dollars because you didn't have a bank account, right? And maybe you didn't even have a phone. So now that we can even enable offline payments with digital assets with current technology, a lot of these problems of remittances will be solved, and central banks are already actively engaging in pilots, especially the ones that have high value remittance corridors. And that will very likely bring transaction fees near zero very quickly, because central banks have the power to do that. Just using this technology alone, whether it's a private network, private permission network adjoined to a public network, or a public network, or something in between, that technology for certain exists and it almost has to be adopted. So it's a really great thing for people that need to send money to their family that live in another country, right? Because instead of paying the 7 to 10% that Western Union is robbing them of, they could do it for almost zero in the very near future.
Leslie had a question. She wanted you to elaborate a little bit more on monetizing your ownership of data. Are there any companies that are doing landmark work on this?
There's a lot of companies that are doing work on this for sure. And that's kind of the nature of startups in general, but I think it's even more dispersed because everybody in the world sees the same value, and there's many companies that are working on solving those very problems and figuring out not just the problems to be solved, because those might be more obvious, but the hard part about it, again, is there's a natural competition that arises from a network that can capture the most transaction fees, right? So interoperability standards have been this long kind of struggle, right? Because everybody has their own opinion or way or want of doing something, because there's so many different ways to do it. And there's also value in owning that intellectual property or owning that network because of network effects and all of these things we've spoken about. So there's competition, right? Which, the free market should allow for, I guess. And that is the hard part, right? Is that this is kind of, if there was a degree of integrity to how these things were rolled out, the proponents or the creators behind them probably wouldn't want to keep all the money for themselves, right? It would have to be somewhat selfless in its design, which is pretty contradictory to human nature in general, as we know. But it's certainly possible, and it seems like a lot of people are doing a lot of really good things. And you just have to do your homework. Let Google be your best friend. All the information is out there, and those companies that are more transparent about what they're doing and how they're doing it are obviously more trustworthy. So my recommendation would be to just don't invest in things or waste your time on things where there's a lack of transparency, right? Transparency creates the accountability, and that accountability is what will generate real results.
Nice. If you do have any last questions, this is the time to ask. So we have a few more minutes left. Do you have any recommendations as to where people could start in terms of building a wallet on the exchange, building a wallet off of the exchange, and then a hard?
Yeah. Yeah, look, the easiest way to kind of dip your toes in the water is something like Coinbase, where it's just like setting up an account. You're trusting Coinbase. It's a trustworthy, institution, and that they haven't lost money, and they list, mainstream tokens that there's, a strong mutual belief in decentralized ownership of, like Bitcoin, Ethereum, etc. And that is kind of hard to go wrong with that as a first step. There's non-custodial wallets that can even live in your browser, like MetaMask, for instance. But one of the limitations that we neglected to speak about earlier, Robert, is that not all wallets can host all assets, and not all wallets can interface with all exchanges, right? There's different types of exchanges that host different types of transactions and tokens and conversions and currencies. And so you have, for example, there's fiat on and off ramps, right? Converting fiat to a crypto asset. And then there's crypto asset to crypto asset, stable coins, all these mixes of things. There's truly decentralized exchanges with no single owner, right? A DEX, as it's commonly known, where you need a specific wallet to connect to that DEX, right? Which is typically a non-custodial wallet. Then there's centralized exchanges like those in the United States that are completely regulated, and there's full KYC and AML and identity procedures like Coinbase and Gemini and all those, and Kraken based in Europe. And then there's exchanges that are domiciled in a place where the regulation is very light, like Binance, for example. Binance has moved its jurisdiction multiple times to ensure that they don't have to compete with regulations that are cumbersome to their business appetites, right? And so because those jurisdictions exist, it's also very difficult to prevent someone from participating in this, borderless or Web 3.0 economy, right? So generally, there's many ways to enter. Yeah, John, Square Cash is a very simple UX. Again, there's always a compromise between the ease of use and security and who you give your trust to, right? And so you have to decide on that balance for yourself, depending on your use case and what your risk appetite is, what you hope to achieve, what tokens you're interested in. And it's different in every jurisdiction, even on a state-by-state basis in the US, right? Some states are allowed to buy and invest in other tokens and others are not. Not to mention on a country-to-country basis, where India, for example, outright banned crypto, right? And other countries like Switzerland have a pretty open framework for it. And then places like Malta are pretty much lawless. So there's a really interesting developing landscape, but you have to decide for yourself, what you're interested in, what you believe in, right? What you think is a good thing to invest in, from a value perspective, but also I would say a moral perspective, right? Because of this potential for self-sovereignty and claims on digital assets, you also have the responsibility that comes with that, right? So as citizens of the world that we have a responsibility to improve, we should take that responsibility seriously and vote with our feet. And you vote for your feet by doing your research.
One last question
or vote with your wallet. Vote with your wallet. That's another way of putting it.
Definitely. Have you heard of any interesting projects combining blockchain and supply chain?
There's tons, yeah. VeChain is a very popular first layer protocol for supply chain tracking, tracing. IBM built a private network implementation called Food Trust with huge participation from very big companies that went very well. There's all sorts of supply chain and authenticity use cases that are now being kind of moved beyond the pilot phase. And again, it's a very tricky technology. It's going to take a long time to implement, but it does have value. And to be honest, creating these things in the real world is very hard, right? Just because you have to prove authenticity of all of the actors, right, that are involved in the supply chain. And in the real world, it's much more easily manipulable than it is in the digital one. So we'll likely see a lot more of the digital focused use cases, like NFTs of digital art, right, is a big thing right now that's happening very quickly and very easily. DeFi, right, because it's all digital, right? As long as you prove your identity on these platforms, you essentially have the ability to issue and receive loans. So those digital use cases will probably be will come to commercial utility faster, but the real physical world use cases, especially in supply chain automation and IoT, will likely take a much longer time to develop, but are certainly being developed and looked at very seriously by the companies that should be looking at them for sure.
Nice. So one final question. What's the one takeaway you want our audience members to walk away with?
I would say there's a lot of value in self-sovereignty, right? And the freedom that comes along with it. But like Peter Parker's uncle told him, with great power comes great responsibility, right? And you can claim that power now, right? And in the coming months and years. But do your homework, understand it, understand what that means for you, understand what it means for you financially, and educate your friends about it when you educate yourself, because it's valuable for everybody. And if people do it with best intentions, although, they say the road to hell is paved with them, hopefully we'll have a good long-term result.
Awesome. Well, thank you. There is one last question. Carlos added it in.
Sure.
About Bitcoin ATMs. Are they trustworthy to buy from? And how does it work exchanging it from the ATM to your wallet?
Yes. So most of the time they'll issue a paper wallet in the form of a receipt, and that is just as trustworthy generally as, any other wallet, right? But again, do your homework. But I've interacted with a lot of the Bitcoin ATM companies, and because they're so heavily regulated, they at least in the US, it's very difficult for them to play any games, and they're generally trustworthy, honestly. I haven't heard too many stories of Bitcoin ATMs besides user error, messing up their wallets or losing their seed phrases. So they are generally trustworthy, but before you buy one, I would verify it quickly with a Google search and see what the website looks like and all that kind of stuff, because without a doubt, the crypto space has been riddled with liars, cheaters, fraud, and absolute nonsense. And so you do have to be careful. So an absolute disclaimer in every regard is to do your own homework and be responsible for your decisions, because you can't just blindly accept truth in this trustless world.
Great wise words. Well, I want to thank you so much, James, for being with us tonight, sharing your knowledge with us, and just educating our audience on crypto wallets and how to manage them and the best practices as well too. So thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah, if you guys have any further questions, you can reach out to me. If you have questions with respect to Tangem, my email is james@tangem.com. My personal email is james.loperfido@gmail.com. I'll leave it in the chat here for everybody to say hello if they'd like.
Awesome. So thank you so much. Hope everybody has a great evening. Hope you enjoyed the conversation tonight, and we look forward to seeing you at our next one. So thank you very much.
Awesome.
Have a great evening.
Thanks so much for having me, Robert. Good evening, everybody.
No worries. Bye.
Take care.